Hello, this is Dr. Jean, dear future people. This is going to be a little bit of a review. And then we will talk about conflict, how to handle conflict, and how to find alternatives to conflict. But first, let's talk about truth again. So we said that every truth has a domain. And that means conditions and circumstances in which it was originally established as an observation. So you make several observations, you generalize on the basis of those observations, and those observations may have something in common. But those observations are all linked to certain conditions and circumstances. Now, in science, when you make an experiment, you artificially fix those conditions and circumstances. And that means that your results are going to be affected by this fixing, how you fixed conditions and circumstances. And that also going to affect the domain of your truth. Okay, so to produce that result, you will have to fix those things again in the same way. So it's very important to understand that truth is assumed to be true in other domains only by extension. Okay, so there is no such thing as a truth coming about without conditions and circumstances in which the observations and generalizations of those truths were originally obtained, right? So if you generalize, you extend those truths, that means that you extend the domain. And whenever you extend the domain, and you maybe don't know the domain, and you don't know what kind of circumstances and conditions you are going to get, then you are going to make a mechanical linear extrapolation. So linear extrapolation is a special kind of extension where you don't know what to adjust your domain to, and therefore you extend your domain mechanically, okay? Unknowingly, you don't know what you're going to get. So linear extrapolation is kind of a mechanic, automatic extension of your truth domain. On the motto, if it's true here, why would it not be true elsewhere? Or if it's true for us, how can it not be true for them? But whenever you do linear extrapolation, you always have to be cognizant that you extended the domain of a truth, not knowing how relevant that truth is going to be in this extended domain. Therefore, we introduce truth value to inquire into how much relevance that truth is going to have in this extended domain. And the higher the truth value, the more relevance. Okay? So, how much this observation holds in local, unique circumstances in this extended part of the domain. So, if local uniqueness is ignored, if you extrapolate mechanically, then not knowing what your extension is going to be, you will have to create an assumed part of extension, right? So if you don't know the truth value, if you don't know the relevance, because you don't know the domain that you're getting into, okay, then you have to have a first idea, a first approach. And that first idea and first approach is going to be that conditions and circumstances are going to be very similar. Okay, so what I observed here under one set of circumstances is going to be very similar there, and the circumstances are going to be similar. And because that's based on an assumption, you assume that there things are going to be similar to here. Therefore, this is going to be a virtual domain. Okay? It's going to be virtual because you cannot be sure that your assumption is going to be true. And because you don't know, you assume it to be true, and you create an artificial world, an artificial region, okay, where it holds that the circumstances and conditions are similar to your original domain. Okay, so virtual domain is also called artificial world or virtual reality. Virtual reality in 2023 was just a popular expression. So, virtual reality can be very easily recognized. If we think about how virtual reality came about, then we understand the basic properties of virtual reality. So virtual reality is going to be objective. Of course it's going to be objective because I standardized, I fixed the observer, okay? I fixed the circumstances, okay? So it's not going to depend on any observers because they all recognize that the conditions and circumstances are fixed, okay? So there's a consensus about those fixations. So of course it's going to be objective. It's going to be posidimensional because since it is artificial and the sentient mind can only take into account a certain number of dimensions, and those dimensions are automatically extended from here to there, therefore it has to be posidimensional. So anything artificial has to be posidimensional, right? Because you have a sentient being who created that reality, who is not able to handle more than a handful of dimensions. So it has to be also linear. Okay, it is homogeneous, lacking variety, hence linear extrapolation. So linear is here a symbol for artificiality, for the virtual nature of this extension. Okay, so you can kind of reverse this and then say that whatever seems objective, posidimensional, and linear must be artificial. Why? Because it bears the marks of what artificial usually is. Of course, that's just a generalization, but I mean, it's just a useful aspect that might raise your suspicion that you are here handling with an artificial reality. So let's understand this using some pictures. Okay, so virtual domain is like there is a more complex thing, a more regular thing, and you try to approach it by linearity. Okay? So this is artificial. This is the natural thing that you are trying to describe, and this is the artificial part that you are trying to describe it with. Now, the same thing here. Here is a curve, okay, which is, you want to simplify it. You want to reduce it into something that that sentient being can easily handle, okay? And you make, efforts by drawing lines. In other words, linear efforts. You make linear efforts to describe that curve. Now, please understand one thing here, okay? And that is that if you have a sentient being with a given amount of things that that sentient being can handle. So a given amount of dimensions, okay? Then what you're gonna get is a perspective that can handle this much, okay? So now just let's think about this curve here, okay? And so you have a curve like this, and then you have your attention, which can handle about this much of that curve, okay? And notice that the less you can handle of that curve, the more it's gonna look linear, okay? Because the curviness is gonna be seen less and less and less. Now, if you, on the other hand, can handle a lot of information and your perspective is very wide, then you can see how much this curve is not a straight line. It's different from a straight line, okay? And again, the more you are able to see of how a thing is different here than there, the less linear you're going to be in your assumptions, right? And so the more multidimensional something, the more you can distinguish the actual differences of how one thing can be different here versus there. And again, virtual domain is like a circle that you enlarge, okay? By one mathematical or geometrical operation, you get a bigger circle and a bigger circle and a bigger circle, but it's just a mechanical enlargement, okay, by a simple operation. So linear extrapolation may not be actually linear, but it's mechanic, okay? It's simplistic. So then, a virtual domain is based on an artificial operation, whether it's actually linear or just based on a simple mathematical iteration of a simple mathematical operation, okay? And it creates a virtual infinity. That's what we talked about when we talked about the nature of infinity, okay? That you try to compensate for the difference of the actual extended domain versus your uh, assumptions, okay, by by substituting the qualitative differences by introducing more and more and more quantitative iteration. So when you are using calculus as a mathematical idea, then what you're going to do is you're trying to approximate a curve by a straight line, okay? And then you assume that the more you iterate this operation, in other words, you make very small portions of this curve, okay? And then for every small portion, you approximate it with a straight line. And if you do this enough, then you are going to be almost equivalent to the curve, okay? But for that, you need to focus your attention to very, very small part of the curve, okay? And you do this at every region of that curve, okay? So the important thing here is that you are thinking about mathematical operations iterated, and then you believe that you actually get close to something, okay? But if your attention is wide enough, if your perspectives are very wide, then no matter what you do, any straight line and any curve are going to separate out because they are fundamentally different. Okay? And so imagine or understand rather that these straight lines are all imaginary. Okay? These things are all based on generalizations and mechanical iterations and describe things only um, very, very approximately by mechanical iterations. So, in artificial worlds, however they may have come about, you always have a center with fixed laws. Why? Because your assumptions, okay, are based upon what you regard as most important or the original point. And that original point is going to be your center. And you're going to have fixed laws, like mathematical operations with which you approximate the curve, right? You are going to have rules with which take into account very little of what the actual domain is, because you mechanically extended that. And you have uniqueness suppressed. You actually don't even know what uniqueness is because you brought with yourself your original dimensions, right? Which may not be useful in the extended domain, right? And so you may have to, in the future, introduce new dimensions because you may have a domain that is so different from your original domain that you need new aspects, new viewpoints to understand, to interpret the results that you may get from this artificial domain, from this new domain, extended domain. And so this is the mechanism, okay? Center, fixed laws, fixed rules, uniqueness suppressed, objectivity that lead to hierarchy also, okay? You kind of take one particular aspect and from that aspect, you order people, for instance, okay? From one aspect, you order people. That's how you get to hierarchy and representation and exploitation. And this always carries idolatry and parasitism as a risk. Now, sometimes this can be useful. If you have a very dangerous situation, okay, then you have to use some kind of assumptions because you just have to. Okay, you have a lot of unknown things, but you have to act. So what do? You make use of whatever assumptions you may have. Okay, for example, in the military and in the medical profession. And we alluded to this already in some of our previous lectures. So an organized mind recognizes artificial worlds, okay? And an organized mind is able to recognize on what assumptions those artificial worlds are based because an organized mind will be able to study the original set of circumstances, ideally, okay, and understand what assumptions led to those extensions, okay, and then the mind will then see the necessary dimensions that you have to add, and then you can increase the truth value of any kind of statements on the basis of these extra dimensions that you distinguish from the assumptions that were introduced in terms of the artificial extension. Okay, so mind organization though requires maintenance. um, like a ball needs to be held to maintain its height, okay? Like a garden needs to be constantly cultivated. So that is our idea, that if you don't do this, then what you're going to do is you just simply accept those assumptions that extended as a linear extrapolation the original observations, and then what are you going to get? You're going to get artificial and very highly irrelevant laws, rules, statements, truths, right? So this is the mechanism. So artificial worlds require less maintenance, of course, because you simply just accept the assumptions on the basis of which the artificial worlds were created, okay? And you don't think through what those assumptions were and how relevant they are and how you can correct them by introducing appropriate new dimensions. Therefore, mental inertia, okay, always means accepting assumptions without questioning, okay? And therefore, there's a drift toward virtuality because you maintain the original assumptions and you continue to think post-dimensionally, and you bend your actual observations to conform with your assumptions, right? And that's usually called orthodoxy. Okay. So again, let's reiterate that if you have an organized mind, you have matrix thinking. So you take into account a lot of dimensions, a lot of factors. And then if you do that, then you continuously correct your original assumptions that are based on you not knowing how the extended domain differs from your original domain, okay? So you consider a lot of dimensions and then you add even more dimensions as much as you extend the domain because you have more and more and more and more local uniqueness to consider. And so you have effect fields, unique summations at any point. Of course, that's the basis of local uniqueness. And so because you have local uniqueness, you are going to have less and less and less similarities. The more you extend something, you have less and less similarities between this point and this point, and therefore your truth value is going to tend to drop, and therefore you will have to make new assumptions, more complex assumptions. Okay? So the more dimensions you consider, the less there's going to be homogeneity and hierarchy, you see. Because you can only have homogeneity, uniformity, okay, if you consider just a few dimensions. The more dimensions you consider, the more you see the local uniqueness that is natural to reality. So the state of a system, what do we call a state of a system? A snapshot. As curves also appear in time, so the system also follows a certain pattern, okay? And if your viewpoint is very narrow, okay, then you see very little of that pattern. But the wider your perspective is, the more you see a complex pattern. So there's a question of noticing differences. Of course, there is the observer resolution that can be also increased by organizing the mind. There's a question of understanding not only local uniqueness, but also how local uniqueness and the observer interact. Now, this is difficult. So, in other words, here's what happens. It's not only some kind of objective space that changes when you extend a truth, but also the new domain is going to interact with the observer. So the observer itself may be changed, okay, by this interaction. So the organized mind is not fixed. The organized mind will be sensitive to these interactions, to these novelties, to these new things, okay? And so the organized mind cannot be perfectly coordinated. Why? Because the organized mind is in constant flux. Okay, not random flux, because organization will influence how the organized mind changes. But there is a flux. Why? Because we are considering, as we extend our domains, more and more and more local uniqueness. So the organized mind and the new locality will interact. And so that's one more strike against objectivity, because objectivity is always based on a permanently fixed, uniform observer, and there is no such thing, okay? Also, virtual reality is relatively passive and objective. Why? Because there's no local uniqueness, or very little local uniqueness to consider. And so the interaction between this local uniqueness in the extended domain is going to interact less with the original observer, right? So you don't have that inspiration, this need to understand new things. Why? Because everything is based on linear extrapolation, so there's going to be very little difference between point A and point B in space, in time, or in whatever figurative sense. So, objective truth without a domain, that's what we call the absolute, okay, is a useful approximation, sure. I mean, if you don't know anything about your extended domain, then you have to have some kind of assumptions about it. It's excellent for didactic purposes. Why? Because when you teach someone precisely because that someone has very little experience. So we have to start somewhere. And practical applications, like we said, military and medicine and whatever, okay? So you need objective truth, but you need objective truth as a first approximation, as a tool. And when you outgrow objective truth, when you understand that you don't need to fix the observer and your domains so simply, okay, then the less and the less and the less you're going to need this model, that there is an objective truth, that there is an outside truth, there's absolute truth, okay? And always remember that with virtual reality, you always introduce idolatry, exploitation, and parasitism like a side effect of any kind of medication. So, again, let's summarize this one more time. Truth always comes from observations, generalized, digested observations, okay? When you understand that the truth has a domain, circumstances in which, and observers for which these truths hold true, then you realize that that domain that you are trying to extend your truth to has to be artificial because you don't know it. So therefore, that domain is based on your assumptions. So it's a virtual domain. To approximate, okay, the actual property of this new domain that you are trying to extend your truth to, you actually have to introduce new dimensions. And your virtual world is gonna kind of slowly dissolve as you do it. But for you to do this, you have to have an organized mind so that you have the energy and the maintenance, okay, to think through all of this and to refine your assumptions as you go along and to understand how the extended domain is different from the original domain. And please understand, this is not just space, this is not just time, but it's a general idea based on circumstances and conditions prevailing in a certain area as compared to another area. So on conflict. Now, once we understood that truths have domains and that truths cannot be forced upon somebody else because that somebody else may be less inside that domain, the original domain for that truth, then you will understand that conflict is going to get less and less and less justification. Nevertheless, there is conflict. Fighting is everywhere. Predators kill to eat. There are competitors. They struggle to get ahead. there's property, there's territory, there is mate issues. Okay, so in nature, we actually see that there is conflict, there's fighting. Okay, psychological pressure is key. Threat, propaganda, intimidation, deception, cruelty. Now, this is more a human thing. Okay, so whenever there's fighting, it's not just actual fighting, but there is psychological warfare, which is very, very important. So, in other words, again, humans have this distinction that they use psychological warfare more, okay? And therefore, humans tend to love their parasites. Why? Because parasites are best in psychological warfare, right? So, well, uh, whatever, whether or not we're talking about humans or animals or whatnot, you we generally can divide conflicts into two categories. There's predator versus host, or predator versus predator. Okay, this is competition. Okay, and this is pretty much parasitism, form of parasitism. So here is predator versus host. Okay, so this is the predator, and this army is the predator, and this is the host. Okay, so this is very easy. Now, then we have predator versus predator, like that. So, predators as parasites, they are overwhelming, they're homogeneous, their unharmonious influence create a multitude of foreign elements. Okay, so here's a virus. They come in overwhelming numbers. Okay, they are relatively homogeneous. Then they have a certain influence which is not in accordance with the host's needs, but only the virus's needs. And then they make viral particles and they assemble new viruses, okay? And the same thing with, or very similar thing with tumor cells, okay? So they make tumor cells at the expense of the host, and they are relatively homogeneous, okay? And they feel that they are totally independent of the host, of the organism. Now, an organized mind with local uniqueness considered excludes competition, exploitation, and parasitism. An organized mind in a conflict always assumes the role of the host. Why? Because an organized mind can never be a parasite. Because an organized mind understands that everything interacts with everything. We are all part of one organic reality. So there is no such thing that I'm totally distinct from this part of reality or that part of reality. Since I do not have a distinct interest, therefore, I cannot be in a parasitical relationship with somebody else who is distinct from me and whose interests I ignore, right? So an organized mind will try to avoid conflict naturally, okay? Because it has no interest to do that. So an organized mind has a host rule. And an organized mind has host defense, dilution. So dilution, remember we talked about that before. Dilution will dilute out any overwhelming influence with robustness and abundance, like we talked about already. So whatever poisons you give, and we are talking about mind viruses, mind worms, ideological warfare, psychological warfare, to an organized mind, the organized mind has a lot of influences to consider. So, however, overwhelming this particular influence might be, the organized mind puts it in context, okay? And this context will dilute the overwhelming effect. That's what we call robustness based on abundance. So there is a diffuse, well-rounded, harmonious development that creates abundance, resulting in robustness. Okay? So we have natural growth. Natural growth, and this growth is going to be multi-directional. Okay? And therefore, we are going to be rooted very strongly into this organic reality because we are able to grow multiple dimensions and considering multiple dimensions. So standardization of interest, desires, and motivation leads to competition. We understand that the competing parties are always similar, right? Let's look at the chessboard. This is black, this is white. So these are fundamentally different because one is the opposite of the other. No, this is not true. Because black and white only differs in one thing, and that is color. So if we have an organized mind, then we understand that these parties are basically, if we consider a lot of things, they are exactly the same in everything except one thing, color. And we don't care that this color is very, very different. So one is black and one is white. Why? Because we see that in every other aspect, they are the same. And that is why an organized mind cannot engage in competition. Why? Because an organized mind recognizes that we cannot be the same, black and white, because we are different. We are abundant. If we are abundant, then we are different in many, many, many ways. And for competition, you need consensus. You need very few differences that you delineate. Okay, but an organized mind might do that as a game, but not as a serious thing. Because the organized mind it does not ignore many dimensions for the sake of a few dimension. In this case, one dimension, that is color. Okay. So organized minds are unique. Uniqueness means that we are not black and white. Okay, but we also have shape. We also have changing nature. Okay, a flux based on new information. Okay, so please understand that competition is always based on fixations, and fixations are based on virtual reality. A virtual reality is based on a less organized mind, okay, that needs these fixations. So we have broad perspectives that blunt the separateness of interests, minimizing conflict. So if we have a broad perspective, then we understand that not only that things are different, not in one dimension, but in many dimensions, okay? But also we understand that, that things are different, but also belong together, okay? So they are not separate. We are not like a virus. We are not like a tumor cell, because we understand that we are part of an organism. And if we are part of an organism, then we do not really have separate interests. Well, as a simplification, yes, we do. But if we dig deeper, we understand that we don't. Because there's one interest, and that is the interest of the organic whole. Okay? And we are all organic, an important part of that. So a predator sees a barrier and then breaks through that barrier. Whereas organized minds see problems and then resolve those problems, usually by dilution and a multi-dimensional approach. So a predator sees distinctness and sees superiority. Superiority always has the smell, okay, of a posse-dimensional, narrow perspective kind of approach. Whereas an organized mind sees organic unity, always seeking cooperation. And an organized mind always, always has one fundamental approach to new things. And that fundamental approach is curiosity. Okay? So I'm not superior to things that I don't know. I'm curious about things that I don't know. So if you mow the lawn, okay, then you decrease the chance for predators because predators always hide, right? They usually hide. So mowing the lawn here is a symbol for having order. For order, you need organization, right? And so if you have order, then you give less chance to parasites. Oh, yes, wow, yeah. Great leaders. And the great leaders promise comfort and protection. And for children, sick people, confused persons, of course they need outside assistance. And a great leader is a very good symbolism for outside assistance of any kind. Okay, so they need comfort and protection. And yes, leadership can be extremely useful in emergencies, there is no doubt about that. But there is a side effect. Excessive authority through seduction, extended prestige, is going to lead to loss of local uniqueness and local identity. Right? You delegate out your identity to somebody else by adulation, worshipping. And so you end up with what? Idolatry, of course. So aspiration and competition, power, money, rank, popularity, wealth. Yeah, we need those things. But the more organized your mind is, the less these things are going to be relevant, right? Because every single one of these things, okay, underline the need for what? For confirmation. Because you are not sure of yourself. And so then, if you're not sure of yourself, then you need outside, confirmation that you're doing well, that you're doing good. Okay? The problem with these things are that most of these things are posse-dimensional. Okay? So that you have not enough abundance, you have not enough variety, you have hierarchy, and you have relative uniformity behind all of these things. Great leader. A great leader may be abstract. So it doesn't need to be an actual person. It can be an imaginary person, right? A great leader. A great idol. And that great idol does not have to be a person. It may be an institution or a form of government or associations or special kind of rules, customs, or a code of law. Notice that all these things are subjects to idolatry, okay? Because they are abstract great leaders that provide you with comfort and safety that you delegate out because you're not able to organize your mind. So defense and support for the weak, sick, and the very young. Sure, these are very important, yes, and There's no doubt that these things are needed. But there is a side effect, a monolithic bureaucratic orthodoxy from overconfidence, ceremonies, rituals, excessive symbolism, and they prevent you, they take away from you the motivation for innovation and reorganization. Okay, so life is like a flux, right? And a very variable, very change, always changing, ever changing flux. But you end up with a monolithic fixed thing, and that's not natural. And whatever is not natural is not good. Okay? So what you need to do is mind cultivation and a broad perspective, because they provide a deeper solution. So you need less, less, and less. Of course, you have regression, okay, you have emergencies, and so these things are very necessary under those circumstances. But you need these things less if you have the robustness from your abundance, okay, that protects you from assaults. Then you need less outside resistance. So, local, non-separate uniqueness with organic unity causes a broad perspective, diluting conflict. Because there are no separate interests, because you realize that you are part of an organic whole. And then, if you understand predators, the more you understand predators, the more you keep distance from them. Okay? Now, even so, you cannot avoid meeting predators, and sometimes you do. And if you do, you need to fight. But the thing here is that you do not want to fight, and you want to avoid fighting as much as possible. Why? Because fighting means separate interests. Fighting means relative uniformity, okay? And separate interests and relative uniformity are based on two things, okay? Separation and permanence. And separation and permanence, we learned, are unnatural, okay? And whatever is natural is not good. So that's all that I wanted to say today. Thank you very much for your attention, and goodbye for now.